In 1901, a man named Leon Czolgosz assassinated United States President William McKinley. This episode of Footnoting History looks at Czolgosz's life, his encounter with McKinley, and its ties to a famous stage musical. Hi everyone, Christine here to talk to you about Leon Czolgosz's assassination of United States President William McKinley. When I was a young learner, I first grew to know about this story through a musical by Stephen Sondheim. I'm a big proponent of using popular culture as a means to increase curiosity in the historical past. So my goal for this episode is to start with the historical Czolgosz and the McKinley assassination, then introduce you to the very musical that taught young me about it all. Before we start, though, I must give you my brief reminder that captioned versions of all episodes are available on both footnotinghistory.com and our YouTube channel. Also, I want to give a big shout-out of gratitude to our patrons, like Drew, Talia, Chris, and Ruth, who are instrumental in keeping us going. Truly, we could not do this without your support. Now, let's meet the main subject of our episode. Leon Czolgosz was born in Michigan in 1873. To parents who had come to the United States a few years prior. Czolgosz was one of many children in a relatively large Catholic laborer family. Despite his family moving around a lot, Czolgosz did have some education and developed a love for reading that would last his entire life. When Czolgosz was growing up, he was surrounded by folks who worked in factories with terrible conditions and wages that were far too low. He too entered this version of the workforce. The money he earned eventually helped his family purchase a farm, but his working life was far from glamorous. At one point, he worked at a glass factory, where being around the materials was perpetually hot and horribly dangerous. At another, he worked in a wire factory, where there was always the threat that a wire could wildly snap and severely hurt whoever was nearby. One unlucky day, in fact, Czolgosz was the recipient of such a lashing, gaining a painful and unpleasant wound on his face. This was unfortunately not out of the norm for folks who worked jobs like he did. In the early 1890s, due to the onset of an economic depression, the situation for laborers like Czolgosz got even worse. The factory he worked for decided it was necessary to cut wages, and these folks were already not exactly rolling in money. As a result, many of the employees got together, Czolgosz included, and they went on strike. The factory owners responded to the strike in a simple, straightforward way. They fired the strikers. After this, Czolgosz waited for the dust to settle. Then, he applied for a job at the very same factory that fired him. Only, he did it with a new name, Fred C. Nieman. This name has sometimes been attributed to mean no man, which is a pretty smart name to adopt considering the circumstances, though it has also been asserted that the name was likely a derivation of his mother's maiden name. Nevertheless, Czolgosz was not fated to be happy. He went through a change in the 1890s, where he became disillusioned with Catholicism, in part because his prayers for a good resolution to the strike did not come to fruition, and because he now believed priests were just like any other businessmen. In turn, he began to pay more attention to politics, educating himself through reading and doing things like engaging with a socialist club. But at the tail end of the decade, Czolgosz underwent a health incident that had long-lasting impact. His brother Waldek would later say that Czolgosz went to multiple doctors for his woes, and they told him that he should not work. This decision didn't sit well with his stepmother, who didn't believe he was sick at all. Czolgosz, who was often described as a quiet, cool man, severely disagreed with her, and would do everything he could to avoid being around her, despite them both living on the family farm. Although it is impossible to know if his brother's account is fully accurate, one thing he said with regards to our Czolgosz is particularly interesting. Apparently, when Waldek told him that he must go to the hospital for his issues, the reply he received was, quote, "There is no place in the hospital for poor people. If you have lots of money, you will get well taken care of." If Leon Czolgosz did say this, it is a good look into how he felt about the way the world was going and the difficulty he was having in it. But what was his sickness? Well, with symptoms like fatigue and stomach pains, combined with the fact that he increasingly spent time alone, modern historians often classify it as depression. In a piece published by psychiatrist Walter Channing shortly after Czolgosz's death, He reported that during this period, quote, his friends said he had spent over $200 in medicines. He spent a great deal of time reading the account of the murder of King Humbert at the time it occurred. The paper was very precious to him as he took it to bed every night. King Humbert, more commonly known as King Umberto I of Italy, was assassinated in mid-1900 by Gaetano Bresci, an Italian man who had moved to the United States and who was a known anarchist. For all of his reading and solitude, Czolgosz was not an avid writer. We do not have any major extant writings from him that would give us insight into exactly what was happening in his mind at this point. But it is hard to ignore that he was unhappy, struggling, and well aware of the different ways people experienced life. As the 1900s started, Czolgosz decided he needed a change, and he wanted to leave the family farm. But you'll also recall that he hadn't been making any money of late. As such, he turned to his family and demanded they return the investment he made years prior for buying the farm in the first place. It took time, but eventually he did obtain the money he wanted, ostensibly so he could go seek better work opportunities far from the region that had not been kind to him. Also during this period, Czolgosz ventured into Cleveland, where he heard the famous anarchist Emma Goldman speak. New York Historical explains Goldman's beliefs as, quote, that human nature was inherently good, and that people would naturally organize communities around common interests. She thought government systems created unnecessary competition among well-meaning people. A popular speaker, considered to be a trouble causer, Goldman was someone who often got people's attention, and she certainly got Czolgosz's. Inspired, he began spending more time in anarchist circles, continuing to call himself by his alias, and trying to learn more about the cause, and specifically, Goldman's beliefs. Eventually, he got to meet her. Czolgosz, having spoken multiple times to Emil Schilling, the treasurer of an anarchist group called the Liberty Club, followed Goldman to Chicago, Illinois, and put himself in a position to meet her. Schilling would later recount, quote, he met her on the wharf as she was leaving the boat. He introduced himself to Emma as a socialist from Cleveland. He had heard her speak and was a friend of mine. Then, Emma asked him if he was an anarchist. He said he was a socialist. Then he said he had not read any anarchist literature but the Free Society. Free Society was an anarchist paper. He continued to explain that Czolgosz, quote, seemed to be normal and sound as the average man, though he also said that he could be described as uneducated, and that he personally had believed Czolgosz to be a spy for the government, because the government was certainly no fan of the principles of anarchy, since, by its very nature, anarchy could only come to be if the government as it stood ceased to exist. The concern about Czolgosz being a spy was so significant to the anarchist community that there was even a notice about it printed in Free Society. Despite this notice, his travels continued and he ended up in Buffalo, New York, where the Pan-American Exposition was occurring. This was a months-long event. It had started in May of 1901, and it intended to celebrate the progress and growth of the Americas. There were lots of new structures built with different themes, celebrating various cultures and advances. In early September, Czolgosz decided to visit the exposition, a trip that coincided with the attendance of U.S. President William McKinley. In 1901, McKinley was in his second term as U.S. President. He'd fought for the Union in the Civil War and then practiced law in Canton, Ohio, before entering politics as a member of the Republican Party. McKinley served for years as a member of Congress, even giving his name to the McKinley Tariff of 1890. The tariff was not popular with voters, and it was the big issue that caused him to lose his seat in Congress. And honestly, it cost a lot of his fellow party members their seats as well. McKinley wasn't down for the count, though. He served 2 terms as governor of Ohio before once again turning to national politics. In 1896, he won both the electoral and popular votes. As president, he was known for his extensive travels and for enacting the highest tariff thus far in U.S. history. McKinley's administration was heavily involved in Cuba's fight for independence from Spain, and it was McKinley who was president when the U.S. acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. All this is to say, there was a lot going on. He won a second term as president, where he hoped to do things like work on what would become the Panama Canal, take then rare presidential trips abroad, and try for strong antitrust laws. Unfortunately, none of this would happen on his watch, because at the Pan-American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, in early September of 1901, McKinley met Leon Czolgosz. On September 5th, McKinley attended the exposition, where he gave a decently long political speech. Of course, he would not know this, but Czolgosz was there too, and he was not a fan of the pomp and circumstance of so-called President's Day that celebrated McKinley's appearance. He was also likely not a fan of the speech itself, one small snippet of which included, quote, "My fellow citizens, trade statistics indicate that this country is in a state of unexampled prosperity. The figures are almost appalling. They show that we are utilizing our fields and forests and mines, and that we are furnishing profitable employment to the millions of working men throughout the United States, bringing comfort and happiness to their homes, and making it possible to lay by savings for old age and disability. That all the people are participating in this great prosperity is seen in every American community, and shown by the enormous and unprecedented deposits in our savings banks. This might have been McKinley's United States, but it was not Czolgosz's." The following day, McKinley held a receiving line in the Temple of Music at the exposition, and on that line was Czolgosz. When Czolgosz reached the front of the line, he executed his plan. He pretended that he was going to shake the president's hand, but then knocked it aside and shot him twice with a gun covered by a handkerchief. As you can imagine, chaos ensued as McKinley was immediately tended to and Czolgosz was detained. News of McKinley being shot and Czolgosz being arrested spread throughout the country with near lightning speed. Coverage of the president's health and Czolgosz's alleged motives and behavior were covered daily in national newspapers. The country was told in no uncertain terms that Czolgosz would pay for what he'd done, and he never denied doing it, but exactly what he was guilty of would depend upon whether or not the president recovered. Of course, the papers hoped for McKinley to survive and rally. One example of this is an extra published on September 6th by the Evening Star out of Washington, D.C. In big letters, it proclaimed, quote, "President resting well. Pulse is 124. Respiration, 24. Temperature, 100.4. Physicians seem hopeful." The article included a bulletin that was released declaring that McKinley had been struck by 2 bullets. One, quote, "on the upper portion of the breastbone, glancing and not penetrating. The second bullet penetrated the abdomen 5 inches below the left nipple and 1.5 inches to the left of the median line." Soon, reports were coming out about the difficulty of finding where the second bullet ended up, and whether or not it could be removed. It was noted that there was as much a fear of septic poisoning as there was of the bullet itself causing enduring problems. That bullet was never retrieved. Ultimately, on September 14th, President McKinley passed away. After a period of lying in state, he was buried in Canton, Ohio. Later, his body was moved from a cemetery to the McKinley Monument, also in Canton, which was built under the guidance of the McKinley National Memorial Association. As President of the United States, McKinley was succeeded by his vice president, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. But what about Czolgosz? Many papers called him a coward and tried to find answers to why he did what he did and who he actually was. For example, the Fort Worth Morning Register published an article about how Polish Americans were trying to find proof that Czolgosz wasn't really of Polish descent in order to distance themselves from him. Family members and anyone who ever met Czolgosz were sought out for commentary on his personality and possible causes. Shortly after the shooting, the papers reported that Czolgosz took full responsibility for planning to and actually shooting McKinley. He stated that he worked alone, that the idea for the assassination had only come to him a few days prior to it actually occurring, and that he was inspired by Emma Goldman. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Czolgosz's sanity was questioned, because few could comprehend that you could assassinate a president without being a, quote, madman. So a committee of doctors met and assessed him, declaring not only that he was perfectly sane, but also that he was healthy and not on the verge of collapse in any way. It would regularly be commented that he was calm, showed no sign of remorse, and continued to take sole responsibility for what he did, regardless of any potential consequences. Years later, after Czolgosz was dead, his sanity was debated, and in truth, sometimes it still is. Posthumous reassessments have landed in different areas, ranging from that he had a nervous breakdown, to that he was a paranoid schizophrenic, to that he was a victim of growing up in a horrible time to be a laborer. We may never know exactly what happened in his mind, but it won't stop people from trying to figure it out. Once McKinley passed away, the wheels of justice turned quickly. Czolgosz's trial was a formality. He had virtually no participation in it, and it took just over a half hour for the jury to declare him guilty. He was given the death sentence and did not seek to appeal. Roughly a month later, Czolgosz was executed via the electric chair in Auburn, New York. During his incarceration, the prison had received a significant amount of letters for Czolgosz, both condemning and in support of his actions. They were also inundated with requests for his autograph or to attend the execution. He was visited by his brother and brother-in-law prior to his execution. Carlos MacDonald's 1902 article about the trial, execution, and mental status of Czolgosz gives detailed information about his final day, including recording that Czolgosz said, quote, "I killed the president because he was the enemy of the good people, the good working people. I am not sorry for my crime. I am sorry I could not see my father." His family did not claim his body, and he was buried unceremoniously near the prison, in a grave that included quicklime to speed up his body's deterioration. McKinley was the third United States president to be assassinated in less than 40 years. The first was Abraham Lincoln, and the second was James Garfield. McKinley's death caused significant concern among those in government, and changes were discussed, argued over, and made, including increasing the use of members of the Secret Service to protect the president. Nowadays, while the McKinley assassination might be touched upon in schools, it is not often featured in the way that, say, the assassination of Lincoln is. As I mentioned, I first learned about it through Stephen Sondheim's Assassins. It is a musical that I often call perfect, and while that is my personal opinion and not an objective fact, I feel this so strongly that I'm saying it here without hesitation. A musical about presidential assassins and would-be assassins is always going to be a tough sell, but a composer like Sondheim isn't going to be scared away from something like that. After all, this is the man who gave us Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. Building upon an idea from playwright Charles Gilbert Jr., Sondheim joined up with book writer John Weidman to create a musical where a balladeer helps weave together the stories of presidential assassins and assassination attempts, but centering on the perpetrators instead of the victims. It includes songs that are both catchy and disturbing, as well as scenes that are both imagined and recreations of real events. To paraphrase Weidman, the show takes people who were never heard of before they committed their crimes, and who are easy to push to the side as freaks, and consider what we might learn from them if we take the time to look at them. It is not intended to glorify or evoke empathy, but to cause conversation and consideration of complex situations. Assassins made its debut at Playwrights Horizons in 1991, where our focus for today, Czolgosz, was played by the incomparable Terrence Mann. A Broadway run was intended in 2001, but canceled in the wake of the September 11th attacks. The Broadway run finally came in 2004, where James Barber played Czolgosz. There have also certainly been large productions in other cities like London in recent memory. There is a lot that goes on in Assassins, and I'm not going to spoil for you or spend a lot of time covering it, but I want to talk a little bit about how Czolgosz is treated. Set initially within a carnival, Czolgosz is the first assassin we meet, as he comes in described in the script as a scruffy, sullen laborer. He engages with the proprietor, who identifies that he is unhappy, and offers him a gun and the very dark idea that he could kill a president. His big number, if you will, is about 8 scenes into the show. He is given a poignant scene where he meets Emma Goldman in Chicago. Of course, we don't really know what the conversation was that took place, but here you see Czolgosz treat her with reverence. He tells her that he loves her, that he is alone, that he has nothing. She tells him about the appeal of, quote, a world in which men are not merely created equal, but allowed to live that way. It is impossible to miss how this resonates with him. The assassination scene itself occurs as part of the song The Ballad of Czolgosz, which is sung by the balladeer while we watch Czolgosz get closer and closer to McKinley on that infamous receiving line. To me, it's brilliant, because it is a folk song that uses the literal moving of the line as a visual device to illustrate the notion in the lyrics of moving or getting ahead in life, something we know from this episode that Czolgosz was unable to do. Sondheim's lyrics grow more complicated throughout the song and also capture the essence of what happened, such as when the balladeer sings that Czolgosz, quote, wrapped him a handkerchief round his gun, said nothing wrong about what I done. Some men have everything and some have none. That's by design. Hearing songs like this from Assassins left a huge impression on me as a tween who was a future historian. It's rare to get a book and score that do such a good job of encapsulating what we know about specific aspects of American history, while also somehow managing not to glorify these actions or these people who did horrible things. McKinley's assassination might not get hugely featured in U.S. history survey classes, but a piece like Assassins made someone like me pay attention and want to learn more, and ultimately, it is the reason I decided to cover this story today. So I hope you will all go and check it out the same way I hope you check out our further reading suggestions. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I know this wasn't an easy topic to listen to me talk about. Again, definitely check out the blog post for this episode on footnotinghistory.com. I packed it with primary and secondary sources, links to information about the musical, all sorts of things. Oh, and always remember, the best stories are in the footnotes.